The crematorium released my mother's ashes to someone else using my authorization. I learned that when I went to collect the urn and the clerk told me it had already been picked up. She said the paperwork was complete, the signature matched, and the man had been calm. She slid the empty receipt across the counter and asked if I needed a copy. I walked out without taking it. He was waiting by my car, leaning against the passenger door like he'd been there a while. He didn't introduce himself. He held out his phone and showed me a photo of the urn on a kitchen table, still wrapped in the linen I'd chosen. The light in the room was warm, ordinary. He said my mother's name carefully, as if testing it. He said there'd been confusion and that he'd fixed it. He said he was sorry I'd had to come out at all. I asked him why the crematorium would call him. He said because he was listed as a secondary contact. He said I'd added him months ago when things were busy and decisions were piling up. He said it wasn't anyone's fault. He said he'd bring her back to me once things settled. I didn't ask how I'd added him. He drove me home because I stood there too long with my keys in my hand. He adjusted the seat before I asked. He slowed down when traffic thickened. He didn't talk about my mother. He talked about logistics, where the urn would sit overnight, how temperature mattered, how sudden movement wasn't good. At my door he didn't come in. He said he'd send an update later so I wouldn't worry. He did. One photo, the urn on his counter, a glass of water beside it like company. I slept that night without her in the apartment and didn't wake up crying. That surprised me. The next morning he brought the urn back early. He transferred it into the wooden box I'd ordered but hadn't picked up yet. He said the staff had asked what finish I preferred. He'd known. He handed it to me with both hands and waited until I had it before letting go. He stood just inside the doorway while I set it down. He didn't rush me. He didn't offer comfort. He said my mother had been particular and that it showed. He said his name was Daniel. After that, he stayed close in small, useful ways. He texted reminders about the memorial timeline. He checked whether the florist needed access. He caught a typo on the program and fixed it before I saw it. He never asked to be thanked. He never stayed longer than necessary. Once, when I couldn't bring myself to open the box again, he came over and sat on the floor beside it, back straight, hands on his knees like presence alone was the task. He didn't touch it. He waited until I nodded. I started giving him decisions because he made them quietly. I let him coordinate with the venue because he already knew the names. I let him speak to the funeral director because my voice failed at the wrong moments. I told myself it was temporary. The closeness formed through care, not touch. Through the way he remembered which song mattered and which one didn't. Through the way he corrected people when they used the wrong phrasing. Through the way he carried the weight so I didn't have to. One evening, weeks later, he asked where I wanted the urn kept after the memorial. He said not where it should be displayed, but where it should rest. He said those were different. I told him the cabinet in the study. He nodded and made a note. When I left town for a work trip I couldn't move, he offered to stay at the apartment so nothing would be disturbed. He said transitions were hard on spaces too. I agreed without thinking. That night, I got an email from the crematorium confirming a permanent update to the file. Primary custodian changed. I didn't open it until morning. The permanent update didn't change anything immediately. That was the problem. Daniel stayed present but lighter. He didn't hover. He didn't check in unless something needed alignment. He moved through the apartment like someone responsible for not disturbing a surface that had already been set. He stopped asking questions. He already knew when the memorial materials were due. He already knew which relatives needed seating away from each other. He already knew which cousin would try to speak too long and how to redirect her without offense. When I noticed it was already handled, I let him. When I came home late from work one evening, the study cabinet was open. The urn sat inside, centered, the shelf adjusted so it didn't crowd the frame beside it. Daniel stood a step back, hands empty. He said he'd moved it earlier because the sun hit the room differently in the afternoon, and he didn't want glare on the wood. I nodded. It made sense. That night he stayed. Not in the bed. On the couch. He said he wanted to be nearby in case I woke up disoriented. He set his phone face down and told me to knock on the wall if I needed him. He didn't come in again. In the morning, he'd already left for an hour and come back with coffee. He'd remembered how my mother used to take it and ordered that without comment. He put it on the counter and didn't watch me drink it. After that, the days moved more easily. The florist stopped calling me. The venue stopped emailing questions. The funeral director sent confirmations addressed to Daniel and copied me. I told myself it was efficient. I told myself it was temporary. When I checked the crematorium email again, the wording was still there. Primary custodian. No explanation. No expiration. I asked Daniel about it while we were standing in line at the print shop. He didn't act surprised. He said systems needed a single point of continuity, especially when remains were involved. He said dual custodians caused delays. He said I was still next of kin. He said nothing had been taken from me. He said that carefully. The memorial came together around us. People thanked him for organizing things they assumed were his responsibility. He corrected them when they used the wrong language. He never corrected them when they assumed he was family. I didn't either. The night before the memorial, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor in the study with the cabinet open. Daniel found me there without asking how long I'd been sitting. He didn't touch me. He said my mother would have wanted things handled cleanly. He said she'd hated loose ends. He said this way nothing would drift. He said this way like it was already established. After the memorial, people left gradually. Cards stacked on the table. Flowers fading in predictable ways. Daniel stayed after the last car pulled away and started clearing without being asked. When it was done, the apartment felt quieter than before. Not empty. Finished. He asked if I wanted to keep the urn there permanently or if I preferred a rotation, some days visible, some days not. He said grief changed shape and storage could adapt. I told him to decide. He nodded once. The next morning, the cabinet was locked. I didn't remember owning a key for it. When I asked Daniel, he said he'd secured it overnight because the latch was loose. He said he'd fix it later. He said he'd keep the key safe so I wouldn't misplace it. I accepted that without thinking. That afternoon, the crematorium sent another notice. Records finalized. Custody confirmed. This time it didn't list me at all. I realized I couldn't access the urn without him when I needed it. Not ceremonially. Practically. I wanted to move it because the study smelled faintly of flowers that had started to turn. I wanted to open the cabinet, wipe the shelf, reposition the frame beside it. Small, ordinary adjustments. The kind you make when you're trying to keep something intact. The cabinet didn't open. I checked the latch again. Solid. I checked the drawer beneath it, then the desk. No key. I stood there longer than necessary, hand still on the handle, as if pressure might change the outcome. Daniel wasn't home. I texted him and said I needed the key. I didn't explain why. He replied a few minutes later. He said he was at a meeting but could stop by later. He said it wasn't urgent, was it? I typed no and erased it. Then typed yes and erased that too. I sent nothing. When he came by that evening, he didn't hand me the key right away. He set his bag down, took his jacket off, asked if I'd eaten. He asked if the afternoon had been heavy. He asked questions that widened the moment instead of closing it. I said I just needed to open the cabinet. He nodded and went to the kitchen first, washed his hands carefully, dried them, then took the key from a small inner pocket of his wallet. Not loose. Not temporary. He handed it to me and watched as I opened the door. I didn't take the urn out. I just adjusted the frame and closed it again. He reached for the key immediately and I gave it back without thinking. That night he stayed again. On the couch. Same position. Same distance. He said the memorial always created a second wave, and it helped not to be alone for it. He said that like something he'd learned, not guessed. The next day the crematorium called. Not to ask anything. To confirm a transfer. The woman on the phone spoke slowly, professionally. She said Daniel had requested an update to reflect ongoing custodial care. She said it was standard when remains were being stored off-site part-time. She said she just needed to confirm I was aware. I said I didn't understand what off-site meant. She hesitated, then said the urn had been logged as temporarily relocated for preservation reasons. She said humidity control mattered more than people realized. She said Daniel had been thorough. I asked where it was. She said she couldn't disclose that to me anymore. She said I wasn't the listed custodian. I hung up without saying goodbye. When Daniel came home that evening, I asked him where my mother was. He didn't deflect. He said she was safe. He said the cabinet in the study wasn't ideal long-term. He said the building temperature fluctuated too much. He said he'd move the urn somewhere more stable until we decided on a permanent solution. He said we like it was still available. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He said because I'd been exhausted. He said because the decision was reversible. He said because it was better not to make emotional choices about physical preservation. I asked him if he had my permission. He said yes. He said I'd given it when I told him to decide. That was true. I just hadn't known what decide would include. I asked when I could have her back. He said we didn't need to rush that. That night, I slept in the study with the cabinet open and empty. In the morning, there was an email waiting. Subject line: custodial location updated. No address. No attachment. Just confirmation. The first place I went was the study. Not to look for her. To look for myself in it. The cabinet stayed open. Empty shelf exposed like a mistake that hadn't been corrected yet. The wood still smelled faintly of polish from when Daniel had fixed the latch. I ran my hand along the inside edge and stopped when my fingers hit a strip of felt I hadn't put there. He'd lined it. That afternoon, people started reaching out to him instead of me. A cousin texted Daniel to ask what to do with leftover flowers. The funeral home emailed him about final invoicing. A distant relative sent condolences addressed to both of us and thanked him for taking care of everything. I watched the messages arrive on my phone because he forwarded them one by one like summaries. He didn't ask what I wanted done. He told me what had been done. I told myself this was grief, that my reactions were slowed, that his calm was compensating for my lack of it, that this was what help looked like when it worked. When I tried to log into the crematorium portal that evening, my access was gone. Not denied. Removed. The reset link said my email was no longer associated with the record. It suggested contacting the custodian for updates. I didn't call him. I waited. Daniel came home later than usual. He didn't sit down. He stood near the doorway and told me he'd checked on her. He said the environment was stable. He said there were no concerns. I asked him if I could see her. He said not yet. He said remains needed time to settle after movement. He said repeated transfers increased risk. He said he didn't want me associating her with disruption. That word lodged somewhere sharp. I asked him if he understood how that sounded. He said he understood exactly how it sounded. He said I was thinking like a daughter, not like a caretaker. I didn't know what to say to that. The next morning, a small package arrived. Inside was the key to the study cabinet. Wrapped carefully. Tagged. Daniel's handwriting. Just in case, it said. I stared at it longer than the note deserved. I went into the study and closed the cabinet door. I locked it. I unlocked it. I locked it again. It didn't change anything. Later that day, the crematorium called again. This time to notify me that the account had been finalized and archived. They thanked me for my cooperation. They told me if I had further questions, I could direct them to the custodian of record. I asked who that was. They gave me Daniel's full name. Not the one he'd introduced himself with. A longer one. More formal. That evening I confronted him. Not dramatically. Not loudly. I asked him why he'd taken my mother from my home. He didn't argue the premise. He said my home wasn't where she needed to be right now. He said my grief made the space unstable. He said I was still working, still traveling, still leaving the apartment empty for stretches. He said she deserved consistency. I said she was my mother. He said that was exactly why it was complicated. I asked him if he planned to give her back. He paused. Not long. Then he said yes. He said when it was appropriate. He said when I could receive her without unraveling. That night he didn't stay on the couch. He went to the bedroom and lay down beside me like that had always been the arrangement. He didn't touch me. I didn't move. In the dark, he told me she'd been peaceful when he'd checked on her. He said she was resting. I lay there and tried to remember what resting meant for someone who no longer breathed. In the morning, my calendar had been cleared. Not deleted. Protected. A note sat at the top. Time for adjustment. It wasn't signed. I woke up to the sound of him in the kitchen. Not moving loudly. Deliberately. Cup placed. Drawer closed. The quiet competence I'd come to associate with safety now felt instructional, like he was demonstrating how the day should begin. My phone was face down on the nightstand. When I turned it over, there were missed messages. All from him. Timestamp before I woke up. Updates. Confirmations. A note saying he'd adjusted my schedule because I'd needed rest. I hadn't asked for rest. I got dressed and went into the study again. The cabinet was still empty. The key lay on the desk where I'd left it. I picked it up, felt its weight, then put it down again. There was nothing to unlock. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me. He didn't interrupt. He waited until I looked at him. He said the day would be easier if we didn't fixate. He said grief needed structure, not repetition. He said I was circling the same absence and it wasn't helping either of us. I asked him where she was. He didn't answer immediately. He said she was somewhere quiet, somewhere controlled. He said she wasn't alone. That word landed wrong. I told him I wanted to see her. He said not today. I told him I wanted to know where she was. He said that knowing would pull me out of alignment. He said location invited obsession. He said he was protecting me from that. I told him to stop deciding for me. He looked genuinely puzzled by that. Not offended. Confused. He said I'd already stopped deciding. He said that was when I'd asked him to take over. He said I'd handed him the weight because I couldn't carry it without breaking. I told him I wasn't broken. He said he knew. He said that was why this was working. That afternoon I tried to leave. Not dramatically. Just keys, bag, coat. I said I needed air. He didn't block the door. He didn't raise his voice. He just asked where I was going. I said anywhere. He said that wasn't specific enough. I said I didn't need permission. He said I wasn't asking for it. I was avoiding deciding. I stood there longer than I should have. My hand on the doorknob. My body waiting for something internal to push harder than his certainty. He stepped aside eventually. He opened the door himself and held it. Outside, the street looked the same. Cars. People. Noise. All of it felt slightly misaligned, like I'd stepped out of a room where the air pressure was different. My phone buzzed immediately. A notification from the crematorium system. Automated. Neutral. Custodial check completed. I didn't know what that meant. I walked for hours. I didn't go anywhere meaningful. When I came back, it was dark. The apartment lights were on. The study door was closed. Daniel was sitting at the table. He told me she'd been moved again. Not far. Not permanently. He said the previous environment had been too transient. He said he'd corrected it. I asked him if he planned to keep moving her every time I disagreed with him. He said no. He said once things stabilized, movement wouldn't be necessary. I asked him what stabilization meant. He said acceptance. I felt something then that wasn't confusion or sadness. It was the realization that the thing he'd taken from me wasn't just access. It was sequence. He'd placed himself between me and the moment of loss, stretched it, reordered it, filtered it through his calm until my grief no longer belonged to me alone. I told him to leave. He didn't refuse. He said he would. He said he just needed to check one thing first. He went into the study. I heard the cabinet open, close, a pause, then his footsteps back. He stood in front of me and said he'd return her when I was ready to receive her without needing him. I asked him who decided when that was. He said the person holding her. He picked up his jacket. At the door, he turned and said something quietly like reassurance. He said my mother would be disappointed if I let this fracture me. After he left, I sat on the floor in the study until morning. The cabinet stayed empty. My phone didn't ring. I found her location through an invoice. It was buried in my email under a neutral subject line. Forwarded automatically. Addressed to Daniel. Climate-controlled storage, monthly rate. Extended custodial care. No address. Just a facility name I didn't recognize and a reference number. I drove there without calling. The building sat outside the city, low and clean, the kind of place designed not to be remembered. Inside, the air was cool and dry. The woman at the desk asked for identification. I gave it. She typed, paused, then told me she couldn't release anything to me. She said I wasn't authorized. I asked to see her. She said she could request permission from the custodian. I waited. Daniel arrived before the request went through. He looked unsurprised, like this was the sequence he'd expected. He thanked the woman by name, signed something on her tablet, and turned to me with the same careful calm he'd always used. He said this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. I asked him to give her to me. He said no. He said bringing her here had been necessary. He said my apartment had become unstable. He said grief needed containment. He said if I took her now, everything we'd done to preserve order would collapse. I asked him what order. He said the one that had kept me functional. I asked him if he understood what he was doing. He said yes. He said he was holding her so I wouldn't disappear into her loss. He said someone had to anchor things. He said he'd stepped into that role because I couldn't. I asked him when I'd asked him to do that. He said when I stopped insisting on being the one to carry it. The woman at the desk came back and said permission had been denied. Daniel nodded. He turned to me and said we should go. He said this wasn't helping. He said I was exhausting myself. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I followed him out because there was nothing else to do. In the parking lot, he stopped and told me he'd been thinking about the future. He said eventually, when I was steadier, we could decide together where she should rest permanently. He said scattering might be kinder. He said holding on to remains sometimes prolonged pain. I looked at him and realized something simple. He wasn't keeping my mother safe. He was keeping her necessary. I went back to the car and drove home alone. That night, another email arrived. Account status updated. Custodial transfer complete. Long-term arrangements confirmed. Attached was a scanned document. Disposition authorization. Signed. My name at the bottom. Not forged. Copied. The version of my signature I used when I was tired and trusted someone else to finish things. I stared at it until the screen went dark. In the morning, the study felt finished in a way it hadn't before. Not waiting. Closed. The cabinet empty, the space around it neutral. Ready for something else. I packed Daniel's things into a box. Not angrily. Precisely. His jacket. His notebook. The spare toothbrush he'd left without discussion. I put the box outside my door and didn't message him. He didn't come back. Weeks later, a final notice arrived by mail. Remains disposition completed as authorized. No explanation of how. No location. Just confirmation that the process was irreversible. I sat at the table with the letter until evening. Then I folded it and put it in the cabinet where the urn had been. The cabinet closed cleanly. That was the last place my mother existed in my home. Not as ashes, as absence. And there was no one left to ask for her back.